Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about an intriguing possibility for the supposed The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time remake that reportedly will be coming out later this year as part of the Zelda 40th anniversary celebration. We've heard that this might be a full remake, and that it could even have a big budget. There's been a few different sources indicating a few different things here. But it's certainly fueling our imaginations for just how big of a deal this could be. There could be some substantial changes here, and it might be more than just a visual enhancement. So with this possibility in mind, there are certainly been some conversations, there have even been some rumors, and there are certainly ideas that I've considered in the past that I'm now going to circle back to here. Like, what if From Software is involved with this remake, which may sound crazy, but hear me out here, there could be something to this idea. Even if it's not exactly true, there still might be something to it that I think a lot of Zelda fans will find interesting. And so that's what I want to dive into for today's discussion. Now before going forward, reminder, I have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, so if you find yourself enjoying my videos, I would very much appreciate your subscription. And this is actually a separate topic, but probably still relevant to a lot of Zelda fans. Yesterday, Sony Pictures announced at CinemaCon 2026 that the Legend of Zelda movie has officially wrapped up filming here. So for those who are in doubt that this movie would come out on time or anything like that, they have finished filming, so things seem positioned for it to release on time on May 7th of 2027. So that's exciting stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to get some legitimate details about this movie, significant details, when Nintendo starts to talk about Zelda's 40th anniversary in official capacity, perhaps in a June presentation, where they might also announce this big remake for Ocarina of Time to celebrate the anniversary. So then, what am I getting at here with maybe From Software being involved? Again, it's a possibility. I'm not trying to claim this as for sure happening or even extremely likely, but I do think there's something to it. So we talked about this a few days ago, but Special Nick on Nintendo Prime's live stream a little while back, when they were talking about this Ocarina of Time remake, said, "All I can say is that it's an external developer co-developing with an internal team." So we've covered Special Nick before. They have a history of reliable info when it comes to Nintendo things, and so they've said some other things recently, including this Ocarina of Time remake they heard would have a big budget. So for the sake of this video, I am going to operate under the assumption that this is true, and it wouldn't be the first time that Special Nick talked about something from Nintendo that turned out to be true. It's happened several times, as we've covered before. But this idea of this remake being a collaborative effort between an internal team at Nintendo and an external developer certainly gets me wondering about what may be going on. Who could be working on this? Well, we've already covered that Monolith Soft, an internal Nintendo studio, has been working on The Legend of Zelda for years as a support developer to the main Zelda team, but there have been multiple postings on Monolith Soft's website recently that are suggestive that they're going to be taking on a larger role with the Zelda series. We've covered this information already, but it is really interesting that the moment the Mario Galaxy movie comes out, once we enter that next week after the movie release, we start seeing even more information coming out from Monolith Soft on how they've been heavily involved with Zelda development and want to take on a larger role, seemingly kickstarting Zelda 40th anniversary celebrations here. And if the Ocarina of Time remake is a centerpiece to that all, as we've been theorizing, then there could certainly be a big connection there. Monolith Soft may be helping out a lot more with this particular project compared to prior Zelda games. And it would make sense because Grezzo, another studio that Nintendo has worked with to make Zelda products in the past, just recently put out the new Echoes of Wisdom in 2024. It may be the case that Grezzo has become kind of like the 2D top-down Zelda developer. So if Nintendo wants to do something else for 3D Zelda that isn't the mainline open-air Zeldas, then who can they work with to get that done? Well, Monolith Soft, who has already been working on 3D Zelda for generations already, perhaps is the most suited to be a key contributor to a collaborative effort like this. But what about an external developer? Because if we're hearing that it's a combination of internal and external, I assume there would be some key higher-ups from the Zelda team in conjunction with Monolith Soft from the internal side of things here, but then that external would mean not a Nintendo developer, right? And if Grezzo's going to be focused on 2D top-down Zelda development, then maybe it's not them either. We have no confirmation of this, so it could be Grezzo, but it also might not be. And if the stuff we're hearing about this remake, it being a full remake with a very big budget, if those things are true, then we could be looking at something here that's well beyond any other prior remake from Nintendo. So this would mean a different approach, something bigger. So perhaps bringing in talent from elsewhere might make a lot of sense. But why From Software? Why them? Well, my ideas on this go way back. For years, Monolith Soft has been recruiting for this new IP project set in a fantasy medieval world. This could be Project Legacy, it could be related to the Ocarina of Time remake, it might be something separate, we are not sure. But the 2 bits of conceptual art they had as part of the recruitment pages certainly get me thinking. One showcasing what appears to be a warrior princess very much like Zelda at war, and another that has Zelda symbolism with the goddess statue and what appears to be the Hyrule insignia, has this setting that overall looks very Dark Souls-like, very Elden Ring-like, something kind of along the lines of what we've seen from the different From Software titles. Like, you look at that character there, clad in armor, that looks like something straight out of Dark Souls, which is a series made by From Software. Now, if you're unfamiliar with From Software games, they are known for creating the Soulsborne genre, which is a style of game that's a third-person action-adventure, but with a focus on combat that's very difficult, that has a very steep learning curve and is not very forgiving. Whereas you defeat enemies, you can collect souls or some sort of currency that can boost your stats, but if you die, you lose it all. And usually you have an opportunity to go back and get it, but if you die again, it's all gone and you lose all your progress. There's even more to distinguish the From Software titles in the overall genre, but that's kind of like a very basic sort of explanation of it. But many people feel that the From Software titles have taken great inspiration from the Zelda series. But what does the creator of the series, Hidetaka Miyazaki, have to say about this? Well, going back to an interview from back in 2016 from the Rolling Stone, this is what was said. Many journalists over the years have said that the Souls games, from Demons on up through Bloodborne and Dark Souls, is what The Legend of Zelda should have evolved into. How do you feel about that comparison? Miyazaki responded by saying that when I was a student, The Legend of Zelda was truly monumental, so to be perfectly honest, I feel deeply unworthy of the comparison. The Legend of Zelda and Dark Souls are different games belonging to different genres though, and they are guided by different concepts of game design. They don't need to aspire to the same ideals. If there are similarities, they probably stem from the fact that The Legend of Zelda became a sort of textbook for 3D action games. So the comparisons have been made, and Miyazaki talks about how he has enjoyed the Zelda series and appreciates it and has taken inspiration from it, but also the Soulsborne games aren't meant to be Zelda. True. However, that does not mean there can't be elements that may make sense to share in the future. Something I've talked about is how the Zelda series has fallen behind when it comes to combat. Meanwhile, you look at things like Elden Ring, and that's kind of like an incredible example of how to handle combat when it comes to third-person action-adventure titles. And so I do believe the Zelda series could take something away from the modern From Software titles to improve. But let's go back to an old Ocarina of Time interview from 1999. Miyamoto. The sword combat in Ocarina of Time didn't turn out as well as I'd hoped, unfortunately. I'm pretty bad at action games myself, so I wanted Ocarina to have a system with depth, something you could steadily improve at the more you played, though it didn't need to be as complex as Tekken, of course, laps. At the same time, however, part of me wanted the action to be easier than Mario 64. There were people who had told us I couldn't get past the later stages in Mario 64, and I felt we needed to make sure Ocarina could be finished by them. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a proper Zelda game. About a year into the development, I realized that if we lean too heavily into the sword combat, it will definitely end up being more difficult than Mario 64. So we pulled back and eased into the simpler system we have today. And just noting this little explanation here, they show off a little bit of that combat. And here it says, it's unlikely Ocarina would have become the Dark Souls of its time, but it makes you wonder how much more difficult it would have been had Miyamoto not pumped the brakes. So the comparisons, the potential, it's always kind of been there, but it's super interesting to see that at one point they wanted to have a more complex combat system for Ocarina of Time, but they had to dial things back. Now, considering the modern era, if they're going to be revisiting Ocarina of Time in a big way, then they might rethink the combat here because Miyamoto wasn't actually entirely satisfied with it, and they had to make concessions because this was a pioneer of 3D action games, as Miyazaki, the creator of Dark Souls, has said himself in the interview we just read. But let's continue to talk about more interviews here. So we've covered this one a lot. There was this interview from 4Gamer.net that came out last December, where Aonuma very arguably teased the Ocarina of Time remake again, talking about looking forward to the next Zelda game after Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, but also talks about how Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, there are elements in there that may reflect in the next Zelda game. And so if the reports are true, the next Zelda game would be the Ocarina of Time remake. What is it about Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment that would reflect in this next Zelda game? Personally, to me, the thing that stands out the most about Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, you can make a case for the story, although personally I don't think it's really that much better than what we saw in Tears of the Kingdom, just more linear. But the other case, and maybe the better case, is the combat. Age of Imprisonment had really good combat. That's what makes the game most interesting to me. Everything else about it personally, it's kind of just okay. I'm actually not that high on Age of Imprisonment, but the combat though, that is pretty good. I find it better than most warrior-style games, and I do think there are things that can be taken away there that could be utilized in a future Zelda title. As I've talked about, I feel like modern combat in Zelda games doesn't really compare to modern games. In terms of the physics and interacting with the environment, it's well above and beyond everything else pretty much, but the direct combat, where you're using a sword and all, that leaves a lot to be desired here. So maybe what Aonuma was indicating here is another hint towards that. But let's take a look at one more final interview here. This is from an Iwata Asks after Ocarina of Time 3D came out way back in 2011. Iwata, how did Z-targeting come about? Osawa, in Super Mario 64, for example, when you tried to read a sign, sometimes you would just go around it in circles. Iwata, the axes wouldn't match up. Osawa, right. We wondered what we could do about that, and when Koizumi-san joined the team, I said, since we're going to include Chanbara-style action, let's go to Toei Kyoto Studio Park. Iwata, going to Toei Kyoto Studio Park, because you were including Chanbara-style action? Osawa, yes. Iwata, I don't get it, laughs. Osawa, we thought if we went there, we might get some ideas. We got our boss's approval, and Koizumi-san, Ikeda-san, and I went. It sure was a hot summer. Koizumi, yes, very hot. Osawa, as we went along looking at everything, it was so hot that we ducked into a playhouse to cool off. They were doing a ninja show. A number of ninja were surrounding the main samurai, and one lashed out with a kusarigama, a sickle and chain. The lead samurai caught it with his left arm, the chain stretched tight, and the ninja moved in a circle around him. And so, this explanation right here is how the idea of Z-targeting came about. Z-targeting was a big mechanic that came about during this era when Ocarina of Time came out. There's a couple other games that arguably also had the idea around the same time, but Ocarina of Time's execution of the Z-targeting really pioneered how 3D action games would function moving forward. Every time you're playing a game and you press the trigger to lock onto an enemy or to center your camera, essentially that concept came from Ocarina of Time. And so it's inspired many games, including the From Software titles. So it would be a really interesting full circle moment if the external developer that is helping out with the Ocarina of Time remake is actually From Software, because they want to bring them in to improve the combat. I'm really only bringing it up as a possibility. I'm not extremely confident that From Software would be involved, but what if whoever is helping out with this remake is at least taking inspiration from games made by From Software the same way From Software games have taken inspiration from Zelda? If the Ocarina of Time remake has revamped, modernized combat, that could be a big deal not just for the game itself, but for the future of the series. As I've been saying, I feel like combat in the Zelda series has really fallen behind here, and they have an opportunity to catch up. And it'd be very fitting to see that in the Ocarina of Time remake, considering the history of the original game. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.